Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you back after the coffee break and the interesting discussions during the morning on the potential security implications of climate change, as well as positive ways how to address them. I'm delighted and honored to be able to introduce to you now His Excellency Andrä Rupprechter, Federal Minister for Agriculture, Forestry, Environment and Water Management of the Republic of Austria, who joins us for a special address on how Austria contributes to a more climate-resilient world. Austria, as one of the 28 EU members, is committed to the UNFCCC negotiating process with a view to adopting a global, legally binding agreement applicable to all parties of the COP21 in Paris in December of this year. Moreover, last year, Austria published the Austrian Assessment Report 2014 on the Austrian Panel on Climate Change that is conceived as a national counterpart to the assessment reports of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The report highlights that climate change will have severe impacts to Austria due to sensitive ecosystems of the Alps. His Excellency Rupprechter assumed his position as Federal Minister for Agriculture, Forestry, Environment and Water Management in December 2013. Prior to this appointment, he held several leading positions at the national and European level, including the positions of Deputy Head of the Department for International and EU Affairs, as well as Head of the Department for Agriculture and Nutrition in the Federal Ministry for Agriculture, Forestry, Environment and Water Management. In 2006, he was head of the Austrian delegation of the Agriculture Council of the EU. And in 2007, he entered the European Civil Service. He held the positions of Director for Rural Development at the General Secretariat of the EU Council until 2013. When he was appointed Director for Transparency at the Council Secretariat. Federal Minister Rupprechter has extensive experience in agricultural affairs, a field highly vulnerable to climate change. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, thank you very much for the introductions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind invitation to this important event today. It is a great pleasure to be here at the OSCE and talk about climate change. The Paris conference, COP21, is less than 5 weeks away. The last round of technical negotiations took place just last week in Bonn. Climate change is indeed one of the greatest challenges of our times. All countries, but particularly developing countries, are vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. Many are already experiencing nowadays the impact and increased impact such as droughts, floods, extreme weather events, sea level rise, coastal erosion, further threatening of food security and efforts to eradicate poverty and achieve sustainable development. Climate change has already begun to affect us in ways we never expected. Between 2006 and 2009, a massive 3-year drought in the Tigris River basin caused a mass migration of farmers from northeastern Syria to the cities. It was the protests of these farmers driven to urban poverty which triggered the unrest in 2011 and marked the beginning of the devastating civil war that has been plagued Syria for years now. Here in Europe, suddenly faced with large refugee flows, we are only now beginning to feel the effects of this conflict. I'm aware that the conflict in Syria, of course, has very different and complex backgrounds. But my point is that we must understand that also climate change is part of this picture, and its potential to threaten our security is huge. Climate change will pressure our economies and our social systems. Demand for food, for water and energy is increasing, particularly where the population or the economy is growing rapidly. Adding the impacts of a changing climate on water, food and land will multiply the pressures and limit the ability of countries to meet their citizens and their citizens' needs. When institutions and governments are unable to manage this pressure or absorb the impacts of a changing climate, the risks to the stability of states and societies will increase. Even when the impacts vary from region to region, climate change is a global challenge. Climate change is a global challenge with both direct and indirect effects on sustainable development and international peace and security. Climate change is therefore, in my view, a threat multiplier. It will intensify fragile situations and may contribute to social disorders and even violent conflicts. The best way to diminish the threats posed by climate risk is to mitigate climate change and to take steps to adapt to the already unavoidable impacts. This cannot be done on the national level alone. This requires global action. The upcoming UN climate conference, the COP21 in Paris in December, end of this year, is therefore decisive for our collective efforts towards tackling climate change. Paris can and indeed must be a success. Paris cannot and it must not fail. We need a global and a comprehensive Paris Agreement that is legally binding and reflects the maximum ambition from everyone in line with our common 2-degree target. We need ambitious contributions. Reaching an agreement will not be easy, as recent technical negotiations in Bonn have shown, but I can assure you that in the European Union we will do the utmost and everything we can to make Paris a success. I firmly believe that the European Union has put on the table a fair, ambitious and credible contribution to the Paris Agreement with its intended nationally determined contribution, the INDC. The at least 40% target is not easy to achieve. It is consistent with science and puts us on a long-term path to an 80 to 95% reduction by 2050. The EU remains a driver for ambitious climate action at the global level, and Austria is fully committed and supports this position. Ladies and gentlemen, while it is true that Austria got off to a rough start under Kyoto, emissions have fallen considerably since 2005 and are continuing to decline. We have a strong climate policy framework in place now, and we put a National Climate Change Act, a national adaptation strategy and a national strategy for climate finance is in place over the past years. All our climate efforts are closely linked with our energy policy. A sustainable economic system can only be based on an efficient system based on renewable sources. Let me highlight some of the steps Austria has already taken for the energy transition, Energiewende as we call it. Over 30% of our total domestic final energy demand is currently met by renewables. We are confident to be well beyond 34% by 2020, which is our target. And there are even optimistic scenarios that show that it might be possible to reach the 50% even by 2030. Around 70% of our domestic electricity production is already nowadays from renewables, and our target is to come up to 100% by 2030. And as you know, nuclear energy is not part of our energy mix. Austria banned the use of nuclear power by law already in the late 70s of the last century. And we are convinced that this high-risk technology is not a sustainable source. My ministry supports the energy transition also with soft measures like Klimaaktiv, which is the Austrian climate protection initiative, launched with the primary objective to introduce and promote climate-friendly technologies and services. Doing so, Klimaaktiv changes both Austria's economy and its everyday life. Austria is a country with fragile alpine ecosystems. You have already mentioned our national report based on the IPCC panel. And warming to date in Austria has been more than double the global average. Our glaciers, I think you have already discussed about this in the session. Our glaciers are melting rapidly and the number of heavy rainfalls and severe droughts has significantly increased in recent years. Winter tourism is only one of the vulnerable sectors in Austria. Others are, for instance, agriculture, forestry, and infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a challenge for all countries. We know that many countries will need continued support for their mitigation and adaptation efforts. Austria has provided support for a wide range of projects with our partner countries, and we will continue to do so. To take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact is also enshrined as a goal in the 2030 agenda, which has been adopted by the heads of government and state just recently in New York. We all have to take the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, seriously. This will moreover contribute to peace and security. As reflected in the agenda, there can be no sustainable development without peace and no peace without sustainable development. At the beginning of my statement, I mentioned that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. It should not turn into the greatest challenge. Let us demonstrate our collective leadership. We have to act together for climate protection and peace and security. Thank you very much for your attention.
Please.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your interesting and broad overview of what Austria is doing to mitigate climate change and to adapt to it. My question is, you mentioned the global processes, and this year was an important year for global processes. We had a World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai and the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in New York last month, and we are a few weeks away from the Paris conference. Where do you see the role of the OSCE in translating these global commitments into practical action on the ground? Because we have the global commitments, but they need to be implemented at local level, at regional level. Thank you.
As you mentioned, and as I mentioned in my speech, the implementation to adopt the SDGs is quite easy. Okay, it was not easy to negotiate them, but it was very well managed by Amir Muhammad, who was the special advisor for the SDGs for Ban Ki-moon, and it was very well negotiated. Then it's easy to adopt them, but the real action is requested now, is needed now, the implementation of the goals. And they are extremely concrete goals. These 17 goals broken down to 169 action targets are extremely challenging, even for a rich country like European developed countries, but are extremely challenging, particularly for developing countries and the least developed countries. And therefore, to adapt, to implement these goals to real action and to reach these targets, we have settled in the Agenda 2030 that it's extremely important also to settle the agenda of development. The conference in Addis Abeba was an extremely important meeting where the goals for development, for support of development aid, particularly of the developed countries towards the least and the developing countries, is extremely important to implement this. Austria will do so within the context of the European Union, of course. And then I think, for example, one of the goals is to not only, as it was settled down in the Millennium Development Goals, to defeat hunger or to fight hunger. Now the goal is to eliminate hunger. There should not be a person in 2030 that is not able to have a warm meal at least once a day. So that's really extremely challenging if we consider that 800 million people nowadays are not able to have a warm meal per day. And we want to eliminate hunger, and at the same time that means we have to increase the productivity of agriculture. We have to double the productivity of agriculture, also taking into account the growing world population. So it's extremely challenging, and I think it's particularly also the responsibility of the developed countries and the most rich countries to really contribute to the. It's also part of sharing and to support developing countries and the least developed countries in order to reach these goals.
Other questions? Madam Ambassador? It's over there. Yes.
Minister, thank you very much for addressing this day, which is an important day for both France, COP21 in the run-up to the conference in Paris, and for us in the OSCE, because with its second dimension, environmental and economical cooperation, OSCE has a great role to play in this field. And as our colleague just mentioned, OSCE should have a role in implementing the commitments that its participating state will have taken in the COP21 process. One comment I wanted to make also first is the fact that you are a Minister for Agriculture, Forestry, Environment. We hope that one day in France we will have also one Minister for Agriculture and Environment at the same time. My question is about the next Austrian presidency, and we France, with the presidency that we will have with COP21, a great role for cooperation between COP21 and the OSCE presidencies, the German presidency, the Austrian presidency, in using this second dimension, energetic infrastructure building, business forum, the engagement and commitment of private firms in helping participating states in implementing their COP21 commitments. How would you view this, Minister?
Thank you very much for your question. We are very, very closely cooperating now with COP21 presidency with Laurent Fabius and Ségolène Royal, who is my colleague as Minister of Environment. We are very much looking forward also during our presidency in 2017 to particularly cooperate with OECD in the second dimension, because my point of view, OECD is in a very difficult situation right now, and particularly here I think focusing on the second dimension is a good chance for this international organization of security and cooperation. And I'm looking forward also from my ministry, because it's quite a diverse ministry with quite diverse responsibilities, and I think particularly in our contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, we call sustainability, Nachhaltigkeit here in Austria, as we well know. My ministry is to some extent the Ministry for Sustainability also, and we are very much looking forward, and my administration will be busy also together with, of course, the lead ministry, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, to cooperate in the best possible way, and I'm sure there's a lot to do on this agenda, particularly on the second dimension.
Thank you, Minister. Are there other questions from the floor? I have a question in mind. You do a lot of efforts to limit the global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, also in Austria. Could you please give an example of one of those projects in Austria?
I think the main thing in order to achieve our goals and our way how to address this challenge, to meet the targets until we will have a target until 2030, we have to do degree warming maximal limit target agreed on UN level. Our basic approach is what we call the Energiewende, the energy turnaround, which makes us also more independent from fossil energy sources and at the same time contributes to to the reduction of the CO2 basically. That also is relevant for the traffic, which transport is the main emittent of CO2 and where we have the real troubles and problems to meet our sectoral targets. Here we have to focus on a mobility turnaround, which is a sum of measures, but also to use alternative systems like e-mobility, but also hydro energy for changing the current systems of diesel and benzene, gasoline, which is not the most intelligent way of mobility as we know nowadays. To change the mobility systems towards more sustainable systems is one of the main issues, but also, as I mentioned, the energy turnaround, to go more towards the renewable sources. In electricity, we, as I mentioned, we are confident to reach 100% from renewable resources already by 2030. On the overall energy, we currently have about 30%, even a bit more. Our target is 34 by 2020. There are studies, as I mentioned, that it's doable to reach the 40, even 50% of renewable sources by 2030. And of course we need some. There is a question of placing a price on CO2. There will be the question, can we do this alone in Austria, or shouldn't be there a common approach of the European Union? I think it's more reasonable to establish a common approach and doing it in a way that is manageable for economy and for the addressees. Yes, if we agree on such a system of implementation as CO2 instrument of pricing CO2 emissions by, let's say, 2020, that really would make sense because everybody can prepare itself, and the industry, the sector, the economy is ready also for pricing CO2, because they even ask us to put a price on CO2, then we can manage this issue. And I think this will be the most important decision in the next year, to have a price on CO2.
Thank you very much. Maybe a complementary question. You are in a lucky situation. Oh, do we have a... Please, Mr. Bear. Please.
My name is Georgina Nietzsche. You've talked now a lot about a lot of policy implementation and a lot of targets, and it seems to me that you're in a very luxurious position because you enjoy broad support from all sides of Austria. How much do you think the Austrian love and connection to the land here has helped you, and how much do you think that this could be encouraged in other countries, if indeed you believe it helps?
I think I didn't get the question.
I understand that you have a broad support from all sides of Austrian politics for the environment here. And I also notice as a foreigner here myself that the Austrians have cultivated a very strong connection to the land. They love skiing, they're proud of where their apples come from. How much do you think this has helped you and helps the Austrians to further your policies and reach your goals? And if so, how would you encourage other countries to follow suit?
I fully can agree with what you said. The attachment to environment in Austria is very high since the end of the 80s, or middle of the 80s. I think we started already in the 70s when we had this discussion on, okay, we built the nuclear power station, and then we asked, or the government then asked the public if they want to use nuclear power. It's maybe not the most reasonable way to do it. One could have asked them before. I was only a pupil then, not even a student. But we learned out of this. I think the sensitivity about environment issues started end of the 70s, in the 80s. In the mid-80s we had the discussion about Hainburger Au. This was a plan to have a hydropower station in the middle of a very beautiful landscape along the Danube here close to Vienna. I was a student then, and I was active in the fight against this, the plan of the government then. I even asked the Minister for Agriculture and Water to resign, which he did, but not because I asked him. But since then, we can say this was the start of the green movement. Not only political party developed from that, but also the green movement in Austria to take also environment issues serious. It was one of my predecessors, Josef Riegler, who started the idea of the political idea of ökosoziale Marktwirtschaft, what we call, yes, to have to take, it's more or less a sustainable agenda, to have the three dimensions of sustainability, environment, economy, and social issues on the same level, and not having economy before environment. Nowadays we know this is the right way, with having implemented the SDG goals, which is a sustainability, ökosoziale agenda, I would say. We have this already agreed on UN level. So of course this helped, this attachment to environment, to regional food in Austria helps politicians, but it's still difficult to be a politician also in Austria. Because there is always a question, particularly in times when we have a very high degree now for Austria terms on jobless, and then very often in the political discussions you hear arguments. Now we have to invest in economy, and environment is not so important. But in reality we know that particularly the green economy, environment, technologies and so on, is one of the sector which is growing much stronger than the entire economy. We have still double-digit growth rates in the green economy, and what we call the so-called green jobs is boosting. We have about 170,000 green jobs by the strict definition, and I'm rather confident that by the end of our mandate, which is 2018, we will reach and even be higher than 200,000 green jobs in Austria. So it shows that there is already a decoupling between growth and climate change is not no obstacle anymore. Growth and green growth is even a driving force for economy now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Yes, but the next session is due to start, and so I want to thank Mr. Minister for his participation, thought-provoking presentation, and insightful answers to the questions. Thank you very much. This session is closed.